Who owns the moon? And if no one, who can own the moon? Well, this is kind of a complicated question. And so, the first real historical note that we have of someone to claim ownership on the moon was in 1756 from Prussian King Frederick the Great. And because he is such a nice guy, he decided to gift the moon to his best mate, Al Jurgens. And until 1969, no one else really truly believed that they owned the moon. And as we all know, in 1969, someone decided to throw a certain flag on it. And naturally, because the US flag was now on the moon, many people assumed that this was the United States claiming ownership of the moon. But this was actually not the case. And this is because the United States, along with the United Kingdom and the Soviets, signed a treaty back in 1967, which basically forbade anyone from owning anything that was beyond the Earth's atmosphere. And this treaty was then taken to the United Nations, where any country that had half of a chance of ever getting into space to sign this treaty as well. And by the way, the proper name of this treaty is the Treaty on Principles Governing the Activities of State in the Exploration and the Use of Outer Space, including the Moon and other celestial bodies. And just like your friend in high school with a very long name, the world just ended up nicknaming it the Outer Space Treaty of 1967. And it made sense for no one to be difficult about this proposed treaty. I mean, it cost the Americans $260 billion, today dollars, to get just 12 Americans to walk on the surface of the moon. And so this really was a tomorrow problem, which is why it really wasn't worth anyone's effort to make a problem today out of it. And on an interesting side note, 260 billion divided by 12 astronauts, that means for every astronaut that has stepped foot on the moon, it cost the US taxpayer $21.6 billion US dollars each in today's dollars. And so, for anyone who says, oh, if we really went to the moon, why haven't we gone back? I think that's a pretty valid reason right there. But anyway, moving on. So, meanwhile, the treaty is holding in place, and then one day in 1980 in the United States, there was a man named Dennis Hope. And he wanted to start a career in real estate. And after setback after setback and after disappointment after disappointment, he was sitting at a red traffic light and thinking about his life. And then as he's staring up at this red traffic light, the idea struck him. And this idea obviously being that he can be a real estate agent for land on the moon. And just as any reasonable person and also Dennis assumed, that surely there'd be some kind of legal framework that would prevent an ordinary person from claiming ownership on the moon. But whereas most people would stop at this point, Dennis decided to actually research this very question. And upon reading the 1967 Outer Space Treaty, he noted that the treaty only forbade nation states from claiming ownership in outer space. And he interpreted that to mean that corporations and individuals are not restricted to claim ownership. And so, with this in mind, he then wrote a letter to the Secretary General of the United Nations, this being a man by the name of Kurt Joseph Walter. And now, I'll put you in his shoes. Imagine that it's 1980 and the Russia and Afghanistan war is in full swing. There's been a failed assassination attempt on the United States President Reagan. The Cold War has the potential to turn into a nuclear hot war at any potential moment. And you've just found out that Darth Vader is Luke Skywalker's father in Star Wars. And now let's just imagine that you receive some letter from a guy named Dennis Hope claiming to own the moon and asking for you to provide a valid legal argument as for why he cannot claim ownership of the moon. I mean, of course you're going to ignore this letter, and that is exactly what the United Nations did. And so when Dennis did not get a response from the UN, he viewed this as validation that he is in fact the rightful owner of the moon. And he subsequently later then claimed ownership of basically everything else in the solar system, and with this, Dennis managed to successfully run his real estate agency for approximately about 30 years until he passed it down to his son, a man by the name of Chris Lamar. Hang on, I've got to bring up the quote. All citizens of Earth should like and subscribe to this video. Oh, hang on, sorry. Although if you could like and subscribe, that would be greatly appreciated. All nations are welcome to have an embassy on the moon, including non-Earth governments who I am in touch with occasionally, but I cannot speak too much about them. And are they scamming all of their customers? But when he does a sale, Dennis actually records the reason for buying real estate in the moon. And he noted that 17% of his customers buy moon lots just as a bit of a novelty or a bit of a gag gift to themselves or a friend. But that means that 83% of his customers believe that they are the rightful owners of the real estate they have purchased from him. And so now that brings us to the billion-dollar question. And that is, when space travel becomes easy and common, will these claims for all these outer space territories stand up? And the short answer of this is no. And this is for two reasons. So, reason number one, and I'll explain this by using a current day example just to help us understand the concept. So, the South China Sea. So the Chinese government are currently creating artificial bodies in the South China Sea in order to expand their territorial claim ownerships. And naturally, every government on Earth is basically just laughing these claims away and saying that they do not amount to anything and it's not legitimate. But the Chinese government are willing to back it with military force. And that's the key point that I want to get to here. We can have the best legal arguments in the world, but they'll be superseded by the use of any military force. And so this is very likely to happen when we start expanding into outer space as well, meaning that the Chinese, the Americans, or any government for that matter, can create bodies on Earth, then launch it into space, and then claim territorial exclusion zones around that Earth-made asset. And so with this, unless Dennis or Chris have a fleet of X-Wings or Galaxy-class ships at their disposal, they will be put at the mercy of pretty much the entire world's militaries. And now I'll move on to reason number two. Let's just say that we're living in this great utopian future, there's no use of violent force anymore, and everything is done according to the letter of the law. There's a property-owning legal concept known as abstract of title. And what abstract of title is that if you look at the claim of ownership on a bit of land, for that claim to be valid, you'd eventually have to go back and back and back and back in time in order to find the point in history when a nation state claimed ownership of that land. And then once you find that where that nation state owned that bit of land, well then that makes your claim on that land valid and legal. And it is this abstract of title legal concept that puts the Celestial Real Estate Agency in a bit of a catch-22, because on one hand they can just declare themselves to be a nation state, but then under the United Nations 1967's agreement, that will then void any of their claims to outer space because they are now nation state and specifically individually prohibited from owning anything beyond Earth's atmosphere. Or, on the other hand, they can just continue to choose to remain to be a corporation, but then as a corporation, they'll never be able to achieve abstract of title for any of the space-based real estate that they own. And so, whether the future of space ownership is decided via brute force or through legal argument, whatever way it goes, Dennis's claims on all this outer space property is not going to stand up. But I do have to give Dennis and his son Chris credit for one thing though, and that is that they're highlighting a very important conversation that kind of really needs to happen. And that conversation being, how do we decide who can own things in space? And the reason that this is important is that it costs billions of dollars to get ourselves up there. And so if there isn't to be a return on investment for our space exploration efforts, well then there'll be no financial incentive to get ourselves up into space, and this will most likely stifle humanity's progress as we try to explore the stars. And then with all of this aside, it's highly likely that the moon will be used as a future space launch pad in order to launch space exploration missions for the rest of the solar system for the coming centuries in the future. And so now to wind up my main point about this video, it is highly unlikely that this 1967 Outer Space Treaty is going to hold up as we develop the technology to be able to travel to space on a regular basis. And to answer the question of who owns the moon, it's no one. And to answer the question of who can own the moon, the answer is nobody knows yet.